In his book, Everything is Illuminated, Jonathan Safran Foer writes, Jews have 6 senses: touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, memory. While non-Jews experience and process the world through the traditional senses, the use of memory only comes as a second-order means of interpreting events. For Jews, memory is no less primary than the prick of a pin or its silver glimmer, or the taste of the blood it pulls from the finger. The Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins, he writes. It is only by tracing the pinprick back to other pinpricks, when his mother tried to fix his sleeve when his arm was still in it, when his grandfather's fingers fell asleep from stroking his great-grandfather's damp forehead, when Abraham tested the knife point to be sure Isaac would feel no pain, that the Jew is able to know why it hurts. When a Jew encounters a pin, he asks, what does it remember like? Right now, we're in the midst of the other High Holy Days, the High Holy Days which have 2 Yizkers in them, 2 days of remembrance, Israel's civil religious High Holy Days. First, we remembered the Shoah, the Holocaust, this past week, hearing Dr. Frank Summers tell of his story of surviving as a child, living in the ruins of Budapest and Hungary during the Holocaust. And in quick succession come the other 2. Next Wednesday night, our community joins with Jewish communities around the world as we remember those that have died both as victims of terror and in the wars to create and defend Medinat Israel, the state of Israel. And then we make the sharp transition from mourning to celebration as we mark Israel's Independence Day. Rabbi Splansky, Lindy Rivers, and the others on the congregational Israel trip will feel the ascendance from grief to joy as it takes place in Israel. Yet all of us join together in celebrating that our people has a state which we struggled for so many years, a state which we constantly have to work with to help meet all of its aspirations. This season's transitions are in many ways a mirror of the Passover Haggadah that many of us so recently held in our hands, a journey from sadness to joy, from slavery to freedom, from degradation to jubilation. The narrative of Jewish history, as laid out in the Israeli construction of these holy days, is clear. What is the degradation? European and Arab Jewry's end in the Farhud and the Shoah. And what is the jubilation? The founding of the state of Israel. A Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins. Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, in his book, Future Tense, presents one view of this narrative. Jews have been persecuted throughout the ages. They were in Christian Europe from the 11th to 20th century. They are now in the predominantly Muslim Middle East. To be a Jew is to be hated and to defy that hate. As one 20th century Jewish theologian, who I know our congregation knows very well, Emil Fackenheim put it, Jews are commanded to stay Jewish in order to deny Hitler a posthumous victory. Jews are, in the biblical phrase, the people that dwells alone. Does this narrative sound familiar to you? A narrative of hate, persecution. It begins, its remembering in Europe, with persecution and ends alone in the land of Israel, surrounded, isolated, yet strong. It is in this narrative which Rabbi Marmer wrote this week, reflecting on a program Phrygia participated in, where Israel's top military commanders met with survivors. He writes, the message underlying the enterprise was stressed by Prime Minister Netanyahu a day or so later, and which most Jews in Israel and elsewhere heartily endorse. As long as Israel is there and its army to defend it, what happened in the Holocaust won't recur. Israel is the most potent evidence of the veracity of the pledge, never again. In a learning session run by the Lola Stein and Shalom Hartman Institutes that Rabbi Asatz and I attend monthly, we attended it this week, one of the senior educators in our community, a graduate of one of our Zionist Jewish day schools, said, "The Holocaust ended with the founding of the State of Israel, the dream of all of the European Jews." Isn't that narrative just factual? It's what I learned in school. This is a narrative portrayed by the March of the Living, in which many of our community's teenagers go on and are currently on. I saw a beautiful picture of Will Klein recently, draped in an Israeli flag. A trip that this year had around 10,000 participants, among them 150 survivors who returned to Eastern Europe to make pilgrimage to the camps before finding their way from Europe of weakness, Europe of death, to Israel, so full of beaches and shopping malls, skyscrapers and strong-looking Jews with guns. Israel full of life. The itinerary has evolved on the March of Living over the years, and now among the 3 death camps, the 2 ghettos, and the shtetl that appear on the itinerary, there are now 2 other short visits. One to see how Jews lived as part of society in a major city in Krakow, before, of course, going back to the ghetto there, and the other to see a few Jews still living in Poland. The Globe and Mail article on the march this year said, giving a narrative of the experience this year, then another survivor, Annalise Nussbaum, who was in a wheelchair, caught sight of the railroad tracks. Her first sight of them since she was an inmate there. Why didn't they bomb those tracks? Why didn't the outside world help? The world failed us, she said. Interjected a woman from the United States. That's why there is Israel now. A Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins. But what other pins do we remember? When we hear Europe, is it only the pick of pain, the feeling of weakness, or is it also the tingle of pins when our grandfather's fingers fell asleep from stroking our great-grandfather's damp forehead? The painful yet persistent efforts of our people to live side by side with our neighbors outside of Israel. The prick of the realization that sometimes life is better for Jews and the Jewish people too, in England, in France, in Canada. That pin which slips in the hand of the artist who is stitching new Torah covers for the progressive Jewish congregations in Madrid, in Poland, and the many in the former Soviet Union. A few short weeks ago, I was at the European Union for Progressive Judaism conference with our members Les Rothschild and Carol Sterling. We heard from the rabbis in France, in Brussels. We heard how there are some that are leaving for Israel in those Jewish communities, but how the majority are committed to Jewish life in Europe. We heard how supportive, after the terror attacks in France, the French people have been to those congregations. Make no mistake, the European Union of Progressive Judaism, remembering the 90th year of internationally organized progressive Judaism, felt the weight of the Holocaust pressing against it at almost every moment. We were reminded that Rabbi Leo Beck stayed as the elected president of worldwide Reform and Liberal Jews during the Holocaust, serving out his presidency for many years from Theresienstadt. We read in minutes of meetings, congregations from Germany, Reformed congregations discussing the same issues which we today face in Toronto, attracting young professionals, educating their youth, with the full knowledge of what was to come in the later years to those congregations. And with this weight pressing against us, we also heard Baroness Rabbi Neuberger detail the start of the anti-Semitism, which has been in the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, is now finally starting to be addressed. And in caged and measured remarks, she talked about the mayoral election in London and about not isolation, but working with. In very measured remarks, she talked about how maybe it would be better for the Jewish community if the Jewish candidate for the mayor of the City of London, a candidate whose divisive tactics can remind us of a certain U.S. politician's approach to minorities, might not make it into office. And who would he be defeated with? Who was he defeated by? He was defeated by the incoming first Muslim mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who has repeatedly said, leading London means bringing our communities together. It means uniting our city. You don't do that by running a campaign based on division. Goldsmith specifically tried to win a campaign based on division, and Sadiq Khan spent his time instead reaching out to the Jewish community and building bridges. And Baroness Neuberger mentioned the efforts to bring in Syrian refugee families to England, where I know that one of the most praiseworthy rabbis I've ever met, Rabbi Harry Jacobi, his story was brought many times as an example by fellow child refugees and members of the Kindertransport, one of whom sits in the House of Lords. They brought his story forward in their own stories to build a coalition guaranteeing that the United Kingdom would take in refugee children. Finally, because of their pressure and the Jewish experience working with and in unity, the government has finally agreed. This is a different narrative of Europe. This is a different memory, not one based in isolation, working alone, but based on working with. One that doesn't pretend that every Jew at every moment longs to make Aliyah, but one that acknowledges that the world needs our story, a story of survival, a story of hope, to help move from the minor to the augmented, the reality of now towards a dream. What does the anti-Semitism in the British Labour Party remember like? Anti-Israel sentiment on campus, the rise of the right in Europe against immigration, what does it remember like? It is important how we collate and teach our people's memory, how we tell our story. In modern times, how we form our own version of the Haggadah following the Holocaust. Rabbi Sachs writes, "This book, Future Tense, is a challenge to that narrative of emphasizing Jewish isolation. The facts may be true, but the narrative is wrong." He gives a list of reasons why this narrative of living in a world of Jewish isolation and being alone is dangerous. Firstly, it isn't the Jewish story. Second, it risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Believing ourselves to be alone, Jews will find ourselves alone. Third, it leads to a set of attitudes utterly inconsistent with classical Jewish self-understanding. It turns Jews into victims. It renders us passive-aggressive. It makes us distrust the world, which can lead to other hatred or hatred of self. Fourth, it generates policies that are self-destructive. Fifth, it demoralizes at the very time when the Jewish people need strength. Sixth, it will lead Jews to leave Judaism. And seventh, it deprives Jews and humanity of the very thing that constitutes the Jewish message to humanity, the Jewish story, told and lived, whose theme is the audacity of hope. Later on, he writes, "The definition of Jews as the people that dwells alone does great harm to Jewish peoplehood. Essentially, it defines Jews as victims. It says that Jews are the people who, historically, have been subject to persecution, isolation, and alienation. In the 19th and 20th centuries, they tried to integrate, assimilate, become like everybody else, but it failed. Inescapably, Jews are different. So, though they share nothing else, they have in common a history of suffering. The music of Jewish life is in the minor key. Jewish literature is an extended book of lamentations. Jews share a fate. This is the wrong way to think about Jewish peoplehood, he continues. Jews are a people of faith, not fate alone. Jews are choosers, not victims, co-authors of our own destiny, not swept by the winds of circumstance. Without a positive vision, Jews will indeed cease to be a people. So let's think about how we teach Europe, how we teach Shoah, how we create memories, and how we remember. Rabbi Marmer writes of another way his family remembered. Through his family's experience with one of our partner synagogues in Israel, he writes, but there's also a different way to commemorate. On the eve of Holocaust Memorial Day, Kol HaNeshama, our congregation, sponsored an evening that included a presentation by 3 generations of Marmers. Those present heard none of the rhetoric and the bravado to which the Israeli public is usually treated. Instead, we gave evidence of our attempts, each of us in our own small way, to bring people together, Jews with Germans, Poles, and many others, not in order to forget or pretend to forgive, but as a way to try to make sure that what happened then won't happen again, working for peaceful cooperation and mutual understanding, even with descendants of enemies, is our way of saying never again. We'd like to think that it's the authentic Jewish way. Refugee children in Europe, what does that remember like? How do Jews respond? How do we build our community, isolated or in cooperation? A populist demagogue as a presumptive nominee, what does this remember like? How do Jews respond? How does this affect us as a people? Do we choose isolation or building coalitions? Germany's Angela Merkel said these words to the Knesset in 2008. It would be just as fatal to ignore the question of how to keep the memory of the Shoah alive when all those who experienced it firsthand have passed away. It is true that places of remembrance are important, places such as the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin or Yad Vashem. They keep memories alive. But it is also true that places alone are not enough once memories become part of the past. Memories must constantly be recalled. Thoughts must become words, and words, deeds. Shabbat Shalom.